Is there anything that they can be doing to sort of avoid imposter syndrome altogether?
The only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. If all it took was a pep talk, there'd be no imposter syndrome. It doesn't get at the core issue. And the core issue, in my view, is that people who experience imposter feelings.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Valerie Young. Dr. Young is a widely recognized expert on imposter syndrome. She's spoken at many companies and universities, including Harvard, MIT, Google, and Facebook, to name a few. She's been a featured TED speaker. She's an author and the founder of the Imposter Syndrome Institute. Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So I think a good place to start is just to sort of define our terms a little bit. So if somebody's never heard this term imposter syndrome before, how exactly would you describe it to them?
Sure, that's a great place to start. And I would say, even if they have heard the term, they need to understand what it means, because there is so much misinformation out there about imposter syndrome. I'll give you a quick example. These two women went to a nudist hotel and they were uncomfortable walking through the lobby naked. So they had imposter syndrome. That's what they said. And I'm like, no, you were uncomfortable being naked in a hotel lobby. I just hear so many odd interpretations. It's not a fancy term for low self-esteem. And it doesn't describe just the normal jitters, anxiety, nervousness you might have before, a job interview or making a presentation. So what it describes, the original terminology was the imposter phenomenon. And it was coined in 1978 by two clinical psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. They didn't do an empirical study. They were basically documenting what they were observing, working one-on-one with women in therapy sessions or in growth awareness groups at a university. And actually, most of their people they included in their research or their experience was undergraduate students primarily. But basically, what they found is that there's this unconscious belief that despite evidence of our abilities, degrees, promotions, positive performance feedback, profits if we have a business, that deep down we feel like we're kind of in over our head and that we're going to be found out. So the three core components to kind of constitute imposter syndrome is dismissing evidence of our abilities and our accomplishments, externalizing them, chalking them up to luck, connections, timing, computer error, a belief that fundamentally we're really not as intelligent, capable, competent as other people seem to think that we are. And then subsequently, this fear that sooner or later we're going to be found out.
That I feel like very strongly describes almost the exact feeling I feel like I had when I first did my first software internship, and even to some extent as a full-time software engineer, I feel like it's something that's super common. Do you have any idea what is causing it to be so common? It seems like specifically in the tech field. I don't know if it's actually the case that it's more common in tech than other places, but it feels like it's almost like a ubiquitous feeling that everybody has.
You're right. There are certain fields and industries where you see higher rates. Creative fields is one, actors, writers, and entertainers and so on and so forth, who are being judged by subjective standards and their job title, by people whose job title is professional critics. But another area is STEM, right? So anybody who is in science, technology, medicine. And part of the reason I think the rates are so high in those fields is because these are all very information dense, rapidly changing fields. That's what they all have in common. When you get into medicine and science, you're also working with very highly educated people all the time. Similarly, universities, and I don't mean just students, but faculty, administrators, it's a huge issue on college campuses. Again, partly because of the culture, but also you're surrounded by very highly educated people. But I think the main thing in tech, and I've worked with, as you said, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Intel, IBM, so many big tech companies, is because no human on the planet could ever keep up with all the rapid changes. And yet kind of the mindset of somebody with imposter feelings, we feel like we should be able to. If I was really intelligent, capable, competent, I should be able to keep up with all this. And my response to that is good luck with that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Somebody asked me the other day about a computer science degree and somebody with that degree, do they know all of computer science? I was like, No, of course not. And one way I like to think about it is like think about all these other classes you've taken in your life. Like even if it's a class you took in high school, think about how much of that class you still remember to this day, and like everybody around you, like despite this feeling that they know absolutely everything, only remembers a small fraction of what they learned in school and of all the things they've done like over the
Absolutely.
years.
And so much of it has already changed, number one. But then, when you have that big fancy degree, that kind of almost puts more pressure on you because you feel like now I should know everything. When
Mm,
people who've gotten postdocs, they've gotten their doctoral degree, and now they're in. It's like a big internship, right, for doctoral folks who've gotten a doctorate. They have very high rates of imposter feelings because they kind of thought, oh, I get the PhD, and like now I'll feel like an expert, and they don't because there's always more to learn. You'll never know it all.
yeah, that's interesting. Like it's almost like as you gain more experience, like you learn more things, but you also sort of learn about more things you don't know about. So
Yeah,
there's always like a new set of information you don't actually know and you feel like you should know. So I
right.
guess moving on a little bit, what are sort of the actual like effects of imposter syndrome? Like, does it cause people to, as a result of these feelings, end up doing less good work? Do people get less promotions and recognition because they're not sort of recognizing themselves? And like, does that cause them to become like less of self advocates? Do people end up like less satisfied with their work? Like, what are the actual like effects that we see from it?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's not just an interesting self-help topic. The reason why so many major companies and universities are interested in this topic is they recognize that these feelings lead to behaviors. And those behaviors have costs and consequences, yes, for the individual, for the employee, for the student, but also for the larger organization. So you're absolutely right. For one kind of category of response, it can manifest in kind of holding back, flying under the radar, not going for more advanced opportunities or promotions, staying in a job you've long outgrown, not speaking up and asking questions in a meeting when you're confused. The sense that if I kind of keep a low profile, keep my head down, like nobody will find out. On the other end of the continuum are people whose response is to kind of overwork, over prepare. So your boss says, "Could you put together an agenda for the meeting on Friday?" And you submit a 5-page report. Staying longer, working harder,
Mm,
not out of the requirements of the job. I'm not talking about good old-fashioned hard work, but the sense that the only reason I'm successful is that I have to work harder than other people to kind of cover up for my supposed ineptness. For someone else, it might be kind of chronically procrastinating on big projects. And how procrastination protects us is if the results kind of reflect our lack of time and effort, then we have a built-in excuse. I'm not really surprised. I just whipped it off at the last minute. But if the results are good and everyone's like, "Oh, it's amazing. We're looking at a big promotion." You're like, "Oh, holy crap. I just like whipped it off at the last minute and I really I don't deserve this." And sadly, for a lot of people, it turns into never starting or finishing. It could be, the degree, the certification, the book, the business plan. So it can show up on a company level. It can affect productivity. It can affect innovation because you don't have people sharing the best idea in the room, for example. It can show up in retention. There's some research that shows people with imposter feelings are more likely to change jobs and they have less, work and career satisfaction. It can show up in advancement. People not throwing their hat into the ring who are perfectly qualified for that next step, whatever that might be. And lastly, it can affect health and well-being, mental health. Because for some people, there's kind of a continuum. People talk about imposter syndrome like it's all the same experience, but for some people, it's really kind of very low levels, moderate, and then for some people, the feelings are very, very intense. And on the intense level, it can also be very much connected to anxiety or depression, which is obviously problematic for the individual and has costs in organizations as well.
awesome. Yeah, I like that you sort of frame it as it's not just like a self-help topic. Like I feel like a lot of times when I hear it talked about, it's in the vein of like this is like my problem and how can I be better. Whereas, and I think we'll get into this in a little bit, it can oftentimes be like a company level problem, a problem that is sort of not just internal to yourself and has sort of downstream effects for
Yeah.
everybody.
I don't know if you saw this. Is it Team Blind? Is that the name, or blind.com?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
blind is the
Yeah,
like
they just kind of put out just a simple question, which was, "Have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? Yes or no?" Not super scientific at all. But it was very interesting to see how the rates were, like, significant. They were highest at Expedia, and then, Google was kind of in the middle. I know Apple was around 40 something percent, but there was really a range. And so we don't know what that means. Is it a DEI issue? Is
mm,
it the workplace culture unique to that setting? Kind of what is happening that caused such a wide range?
yeah. Do you think with the point of it potentially being a DEI issue, do you see that as like a major player in if somebody feels very unique in their position as sort of a uh, being part of some minority group that they don't see represented around them? Does that tend to create more of this imposter feeling?
It's absolutely an important factor. There are occupational sources, there are situational, like being a student, university student, in and of itself makes you more susceptible. Working alone makes you more susceptible. Again, organizational culture can play a role, but absolutely societal factors. Because if there's not many people on your team or in your organization or at your level who look like you or maybe sound like you, right? I've spoken over 100 universities, and the biggest group to always show up, especially if I'm speaking to doctoral students, are the international students,
Hmm,
which makes sense because they got the same pressures everyone else has, but they're doing it in another culture and often in another language. And let's face it, we all feel smarter communicating in our first language. But if you're
yeah.
one of the few or the only women, you're one of the few only person of color, somebody with a disability, the oldest person, the youngest person, anybody in a group for whom there are stereotypes about competence or intelligence, or who have that kind of pressure to represent their entire group, are going to be more susceptible. And at some levels, to different degrees, we all know what that feels like. One of the questions I ask when I make a presentation is, how many of you have ever felt underestimated because you were the youngest person in a work environment? And we all
Oh,
know,
absolutely.
we've all had that experience. Then I say, well, how many of you have ever felt underestimated because you were the oldest person? And when I ask that question to Facebook employees, the 30-year-olds raise their hand, right? Because that's kind of the demographic, Facebook headquarters. So
Yep.
it's all kind of relative, but absolutely, it impossible to kind of parse out the social realities. If you're the person in the room who doesn't understand, who's saying, "Excuse me, I'm not clear. What do you mean by that?" And you're the only one, whatever that is, you're the person who's hearing impaired in the wheelchair, whatever it might be, you might feel more vulnerable in that situation because you recognize you represent your entire group. And let me just throw one more thing in. The research shows that imposter feelings are highest, and this is multiple studies have shown to be highest amongst Asian Americans. And the researchers think it's two reasons. One, family messages, more of a collective orientation to success, that your success represents the family and the community, as opposed to, Western cultures, a much more of an individualistic notion of success. But also, again, societally, the pressure to be the so-called model minority, ever achieving, striving, excelling, and that pressure culturally.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess with my audience, it's pretty split between very early beginners trying to get into tech, and then there's some like existing software engineers, and then we also have well, every now and then I'll get a comment from somebody who's been working in the industry for 30 years. So sort of starting with the earliest people, somebody who maybe tomorrow is starting to learn how to code or taking their first computer science class. Is there anything that they can be doing to sort of avoid imposter syndrome altogether, or is it sort of a foregone conclusion that they will have this feeling in some regard?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think to be really mindful, my mantra is always, the only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. So somebody who's starting out in a new field entirely, just, again, I'm going to said it before, but to recognize like you're not going to know it all. You're not going to have this day when you wake up and like say, now I'm an expert, where you're going to feel 100% confident, and to kind of start thinking in terms of, being a lifelong learner and being curious as opposed to being an expert.
I like that a lot, the being curious instead of being an expert. Every now and then people ask me about at what point do you feel like you are an expert, or what point are you like qualified to have like the software engineering job or whatever? And like there is obviously some point where you're qualified for the job,
Sure.
but like as far as being an expert, I'm like, I've been doing this for a while now. I don't know that I feel like an expert, and I don't think I necessarily ever will, because I just am constantly finding like, more things to learn about.
Yeah. And here's the thing is there's so much focus on when people give advice on imposter syndrome, and they'll say like make a list of your accomplishments, and which is great when you're starting out in your career because it's good to look back when you're getting your performance review to see what you've done, or a little confidence boost. But the pep talk approach in my experience doesn't work. And part of it is if we're totally leaning into our strengths, we're missing out on changing our mindset about our limitations. I don't know if you know this, but Google has this training called workshop called I Am Remarkable. And it's open source. Anybody can go become an I Am Remarkable workshop facilitator. They created it because their female employees, especially internationally, for cultural reasons, societal reasons, were having a hard time talking about their accomplishments in a performance review. So they talk about, it's not bragging if it's true. And, because a lot of people are very modest in many cultures around talking about themselves. But the core of it is everyone like takes 10 minutes and you write down all your accomplishments, and then you all go around and you say, I am remarkable because, and you say one thing that makes you remarkable. I've done a lot of work with Google. My feedback to them is you need to change the title to I am remarkable and some days I suck. Because guess what? You're not always going to be remarkable. You're going to have good days, bad days. You're going to have, off days, and some days you're going to feel brilliant, and the next day, like the fog machine comes on, you can't, put two sentences together. I think it's so important that we have a healthy understanding of our limitations as well as
Hmm.
our strengths. I mean, I'm really good at 3 or 4 things. I'm pretty good at 5 or 6 things, and I suck at everything else. And I'm good with that.
Yeah. So you mentioned that they sort of have you talking about some of your achievements and the things you've done. And that's something I've seen a lot of people talk about as sort of the like cure to imposter syndrome, is this idea of like celebrating your accomplishments and
Right.
recognizing them. So I guess for people with imposter syndrome, does that to some degree work? And I guess what else would you recommend
Yeah.
people do to sort of alleviate the feeling as much as you can?
Yeah. And again, it's not that it's bad, it's that if all it took was a pep talk, there'd be no imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I mean, Tom Hanks, who's talked about having imposter syndrome, I don't think he forgot that he won a bunch of Oscars. I don't think he has to write a list, right? Michelle Obama has talked about having imposter syndrome. Um, so I think that it doesn't get at the core issue. And the core issue, in my view, is that people who experience imposter feelings have unrealistic, unsustainable expectations about what it means to be competent. The research sees a very strong connection between imposter feelings and perfectionism,
Hmm.
which is obviously there. But in my experience, there's more going on. Like, not everybody resonates with that term. So years ago, I kind of came up with these different categories of the way we measure our competence. So there is the perfectionist, of course, but also the expert who feels like they need to know 150%, kind of the knowledge version of the perfectionist. The soloist who thinks it only counts if I do it all by myself. If somebody helped me, if I had coaching, mentoring, I had to ask for help, doesn't count. The natural genius who thinks if I was really intelligent, capable, competent, this wouldn't be this hard. So the fact
Hmm.
that you're newer folks just getting into the field, the fact that they might be struggling with some of the material and the things that they're learning, and it's not intuitive, and they have to read the same paragraph 20 times to understand what the hell's going on, that sets off these imposter alarm bells because they're looking at competence as being about ease and speed. stepping into a new role, picking it up really quickly, and the fact that again there's any struggle or difficulty proves I must be an imposter. And then the fifth one is the superhuman who not only expects themselves to excel in like every dimension of their job, big picture strategic planning and detailed execution, or scientific discovery and leadership. But for some folks that translate at home, they also need to be the perfect parent, partner, house has to look good. They have to look good, all those other kinds of pressures. If you Google what are the 5 types of imposter syndrome, you'll get like 3 million searches. That's my work, often inaccurately described, but those are kind of the 5 competence types. So to me, if you don't address that core fundamental issue, then nothing's going to change. How we look at competence.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like I was definitely in the camp of like feeling like I need to do everything myself. And if I ask for help on this thing, well, I didn't do the thing. The other person did it. All I did was facilitate somebody else doing it for me. Um, with sort of that feeling, and I think at least anecdotally, that feels like something I see a lot, especially with like interns in tech,
Hmm.
is fear of asking too many questions, which
Yeah.
I've told every intern I've ever worked with, like, there is not a possible way you could ask me too many questions. I think sometimes they're afraid of like being an annoyance to me or like getting in the way of my own work. And I'm like, no, this is like my purpose while you are here is to help you as an intern. Um, but for people with like that specific feeling of, well, once I start asking questions, I didn't do anything. What can you do to sort of like reframe that mindset?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. So they because they ask questions and they had to get the answer from someone else, then it doesn't count what they did with the information with the answer. Is that kind of the thinking here?
Yeah, essentially, like it feels like it doesn't count because
Yeah.
it didn't all come from your own brain, essentially.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's really about shifting. Woodrow Wilson said, "I use not only all the brains I have, but all that I can borrow." It's also it's not it's very unproductive to spend hours trying to figure something out when I could just walk across the hall to the next cubicle or send somebody a quick message. Competence is also about figuring out how to identify the resources it takes to get the job done. That could be information, that could be authority to do something, that could be additional education or training that I need. It could be, financial resources, but figuring out how do I make this happen? I mean, one thing that organizations can do, because you're right, you throw people into these new jobs or like an internship, but you don't make anything really formal around asking questions. I always thought it'd be interesting to give people a little notebook or some place like you're going to have hundreds of questions. Like just set it up from the beginning. And if you don't, we're scared for you, right? You're going to have hundreds of questions. Here's where we want you to write them down. There's 3 categories, like things you have to find out immediately because you can't keep going on what you're working on unless you get this answer. Things you're curious about, you want to know more about, but you can keep going. You can wait a few hours or the next day. And then set up a series of meetings to really normalize the process of asking questions and getting information.
Nice. Yeah, I like that a lot. One thing my first manager did during my first internship at Facebook was I think he recognized that I was sort of this scared kid who didn't want to ask any questions, and I had lots of questions. I just wasn't really asking them. So literally maybe every 30 minutes to an hour at the beginning, and that time frame became longer over time. It became maybe once a day by the end of the internship. But he would literally just walk over to my desk, be like, hey, I haven't heard from you in a bit. What questions do you have? And it wasn't in like a micromanaging, I want to know what you're doing right now type of way. It was in a, I want to make sure I'm helping you and making sure that you're feeling like my help is expected, not you needing extra help.
That's
And
great. That's great leadership. That's a great way to do that, to normalize that. Because they're
yeah,
not going to get the best from you if you're sitting there with all these questions, especially in a new, you walk into a new place, there's new acronyms, new names, new systems on top of your, assignments and your job. So
yeah,
you're immediately in overwhelm mode.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And especially with interns specifically, you're also usually at your first like quote unquote real job and probably in a new city and all of these things.
It's stressful. And so, to recognize, you know, and this kind of, a lot of people ask me, is imposter syndrome a good thing? right? Is it a positive? And there are folks out there who have kind of rebranded it, in my view, as like a superpower. It's like a badge of honor because it means you're successful. It means you're learning. It keeps you humble, motivates you to work harder. The problem with all of those is number one, are we really saying that in response to be learning and growing that we have to feel inadequate? I don't think so. I think we can just say, "Wow, I'm in an intense learning curve right now, so I'm going to feel off base for the first month," and to normalize it and reframe it. This idea that it motivates us to work harder, for some people, that it is motivating. I'm going to prove it to them and that I can do it, that kind of thing. But the research also shows women are less propelled by self doubt, more
Hmm.
likely to kind of pull back than push ahead. And besides, I don't want my motivation to work hard to come from trying to outrun the no talent police, frankly, the imposter police. And the third reason they say it's a good thing, Corey, is because they say it keeps us humble. I've been doing this work for 40 years. I have yet to hear a single woman say, I think I'm going to keep my insecurity and my self doubt and my imposter feelings because it keeps me humble. I've never heard that. Hubris is more of an issue within male culture with certainly some men, not all men at all. But I also think it's kind of a false choice because the other suggestion is if you don't feel like an imposter, that means you really are an imposter. I've heard that too. This idea that you
Hmm.
have two choices, you can be an arrogant jerk or you can feel like an imposter, I think is a false choice. I really advocate for a third, healthier choice, which is to become what I call a humble realist. And the only difference between a humble realist and somebody with imposter syndrome is that they think differently about three things. Number one, they have what we talked about before, that realistic understanding of what it means to be competent. They have a healthy response to failure, mistakes, setbacks, and constructive feedback, which, let's face it, feels like criticism to us. And they also have an awareness that a certain amount of fear and self doubt are part of the achievement journey. So, in other words, they don't conflate competence and confidence like people with imposter syndrome do. They often think, well, if I was really competent, I'd feel confident 24/7. And my message is like, good luck with that.
Yeah, I like that framing a lot, and it sort of uh, brings to the idea of from like the company and managerial perspective, as well as like mentors and teachers. What can those people be doing to help their mentees or their students or their employees sort of have that mindset, and what can they be
Yep.
doing to sort of make a sort of better work culture for that? And I guess like we're so often giving criticism to people in the workplace, right? Like we have to be able to critique work and like
Right.
give constructive criticism. How do you do that in a way that doesn't make somebody feel like an imposter because you're essentially telling them something is wrong with their work?
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's so important that I often say you don't have to feel like an imposter to become informed about imposter syndrome. But if you lead, manage, mentor, train, or I'd say even parent other people, you do need to become imposter syndrome informed because there are such costs and consequences, for individuals, for teams, and for the larger organization. And so much of what I train people on is not only to uh, unlearn imposter syndrome by adopting humble realist thinking, but it can also be applied on the organizational level. Like, how do you create a culture where there is this kind of humble realist mentality, in the team, in the organization? And one place would be, for example, as you said, to address, how do we give constructive feedback? I get that question all the time. What can managers do? um, Especially around constructive feedback. And I say that the first step is to really like back up and get the view from 10,000 feet and have this bigger conversation with your team or with an individual on the role of constructive feedback. Think about sports for a minute. If you took tennis lessons, who do you want as your coach? The person is going to say, well, Corey's holding his racket wrong, but I don't want to say anything because I don't want to hurt his feelings, right? Or do you want somebody who's going to give you the information that you need to get better? And humble realists, they see constructive feedback as a gift. They seek it out. The manager says, did a great job, and they'll say, what's one thing I could have done even better? And I'll
Mm,
give you a quick example. I was speaking at NASA, and this engineer came up to me afterwards, and she had just had her performance review, and she said her boss told her like 5 or 6 areas where she excelled, and then she said, "Is there any place I could improve?" And I said, "That's great. That's exactly what you should be asking." She said, "Yeah, but then he criticized me, and I was depressed for weeks."
mm,
I said, "Do you mind if I asked what the criticism was?" And she said, "Yeah, he told me I could have delegated more on my last project." I said, "That wasn't criticism, that was information." Right?
mm.
He sees you operating on a higher level. So I think we've got this kind of mentality, like we just want to walk out and get all gold stars, like every time, which is kind of like expecting to win the Oscar for every film you
Yeah,
do, and there's always things that can be better. So I think, we need to have some sensitivity about how we deliver it, but I think it's also about really embedding this collective mindset about the value of constructive information that's going to help you get better.
that makes sense. One other strategy I saw, I'm curious if you think this is one that works well in your experience, but at least at Facebook, they had a very sort of blameless culture, as they called it, and a lot of ideas. It was sort of this idea of let's critique ideas rather than individuals. So like I remember in some of our meetings, we would have like a whiteboard full of different ideas we were considering, and we would each put ideas on the whiteboard, but sort of the way it was designed was so that by the time we're discussing the ideas, nobody even knows whose ideas were which. So it wasn't like, oh, I need to defend my ideas because I'm defending like myself and my intelligence or whatever. It was more
Right,
of I'm going to discuss this idea with the team and we are all going to critique if this is a good idea we should be pursuing or not. And then sort of the same thing would happen if something went wrong. So if there was some outage or something, it wasn't about who do we point the finger at and get in trouble. It was how do we fix this? And
right,
then people weren't necessarily like feeling bad about like, oh, I caused the outage. But on the other hand, we had people feeling good about the fact that, oh, I was able to fix the outage.
right, right. Which, in engineering, it's called failure analysis. And you
Hmm.
learn just as much, if not more, when things go wrong than when things go right. And then it gives you an opportunity to figure out how to fix it, as you said, and have it be a teachable kind of moment. I screw up all the time when I'm making a presentation. Well, not all the time, but I certainly, screwed up at times. And, I really use it as a teachable moment because nobody stormed out of the room because my slide was out of order or, I stumbled over a word or what have you. And that's where I think so many of us just have to like take a deep breath and put things into perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining. One final question. Where can people find more from you?
Sure, absolutely. It's pretty easy. They can go to impostersyndrome.com. I've had the domain since 1995, and right now we have a course coming up and shortly called the Imposter Syndrome Informed Coach. So, kind of back to your question, what can individuals do who are coaching, mentoring, become imposter syndrome informed is a great way to do that.